All right, picture this. The Bible. Whether you're religious or not, you've heard the stories. Noah's Ark, David taking down a giant with a sling, a sea splitting right down the middle like something out of a blockbuster. But what if I told you that science might actually back some of these up? Yeah, seriously. We're not just talking about bedtime stories anymore. This is history, geology, and even astronomy stepping up and saying, you know what? This might have really happened. Now here's the thing. Ancient stories aren't just stories. They're snapshots, clues to what people saw, experienced, or thought they saw thousands of years ago. And here's where it gets really wild. Civilizations all over the world, places that never had contact with each other, share eerily similar tales. A flood so massive it wipes out everything. A city reduced to ash by fire raining from the sky. Even a man swallowed by a sea creature living to tell the tale. So, is this just coincidence? Or is there something deeper connecting these dots across history? In today's video, we're diving headfirst into 10 biblical events that science, history, and archaeology say might actually have happened. And let me tell you, some of these are going to leave you speechless. We're talking ancient disasters, mind-bending phenomena, and discoveries that make you go, wait, could this really be true? And if you're already skeptical, good. That's half the fun. Stick around, and we'll let the evidence speak for itself. But here's a curveball. How did people back then, without modern tools or communication, write stories that seemed to line up with real-world science? Is it just a lucky guess? Or could they have been documenting something they didn't fully understand? Better yet, if these stories turned out to be true, or even based on real events, what does that mean for the rest of the Bible? Could there be more to the stories we dismissed as myths? Or is it simply nature and history doing what they do best, wrapped in some epic storytelling? So grab a drink, settle in, and get ready for a ride. By the end of this video, you might not look at these stories, or science, the same way again. Let's get started. 1. The creation of the universe. All right, let's kick things off with the biggest event of all, literally the creation of the universe. The Bible opens with one of the most famous lines of all time. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's short, poetic, and packed with meaning. The story describes a formless, dark void, and then, bam! God says, "Let there be light," and there was light, simple yet cosmic. Now here's where things get really interesting. Modern science has its own version of the story, the Big Bang Theory. This theory explains how the universe began roughly 13.8 billion years ago. Everything, literally everything, was compressed into a single point, called a singularity. Then, in a flash, it exploded, expanding at incomprehensible speeds and creating all the matter, energy, and space we know today. Sounds like a pretty grand origin story, doesn't it? But what's wild is how closely parts of the Big Bang Theory align with the biblical account. The Bible describes an initial moment of creation, the beginning. Science tells us the universe did, in fact, have a beginning, a definitive moment when it all started. Before that, there was nothing. No time, no space, no light, just nothing. Here's another fascinating parallel. The Bible says God stretched out the heavens. Well, modern astronomy confirms that the universe has been expanding ever since the Big Bang. Coincidence? Maybe. But it makes you wonder if the ancient writers were onto something way before modern telescopes. Let's dig deeper. After the Big Bang, there was a period of darkness. The universe was too hot and dense for light to travel freely. It wasn't until particles cooled down and formed atoms that light finally burst through. In scientific terms, this is called recombination. But in the Bible, it's described as, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Two vastly different sources, yet they describe an eerily similar sequence of events. Now think about this. The Bible was written thousands of years ago, long before humans even understood basic astronomy. How did they come up with a creation story that aligns so closely with modern science? Was it divine inspiration? Or did they observe something so profound they couldn't explain it any other way? Either way, it's incredible how the narrative of Genesis resonates with what scientists are still discovering today. But this raises a bigger question. If the universe truly had a beginning, what or who caused it? Scientists call this the first cause, the thing that set everything into motion. The Bible? It says that cause was God. Whether you see it as divine intervention or the laws of physics doing their thing, it's fascinating to think that both science and scripture agree on one fundamental truth. The universe didn't just happen. It was created. One last thing to blow your mind. The Bible repeatedly uses phrases like stretched out the heavens to describe creation. And here's the kicker. Modern scientists describe the universe's expansion in much the same way. In fact, some theorists even suggest that the universe might still be stretching, just like the Bible implies. How's that for a connection across time? So, whether you believe in the Big Bang, the Bible, or a mix of both, this much is clear. The story of creation is awe-inspiring, no matter how you interpret it. It's a reminder of just how vast, complex, and mysterious our universe really is. And we're just getting started. If you thought this was mind-blowing, wait until you hear about the next event. A flood so massive it might have reshaped the world. Let's dive in. 2. The Great Flood. Alright, let's talk about a story that just about everyone knows. A massive flood wiping out the world. A man named Noah building an ark, and 2 of every animal somehow fitting on board. It's one of the most famous tales in the Bible. But here's the thing. Stories of a great flood aren't exclusive to the Bible. Cultures all over the world have their own versions of a massive deluge. What's going on here? Is it all just myth? Or could there be some truth behind it? The biblical account found in Genesis describes the flood as God's response to a world gone corrupt. Noah is tasked with building an ark, a massive boat, to save himself, his family, and the animals. Then, the rain starts. It doesn't stop for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rise, covering the mountains, and eventually recede, leaving Noah and his ark stranded on dry land to begin anew. Now let's shift gears to science. In 2000, 2 geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, dropped a bombshell of a theory. The Black Sea was once a massive freshwater lake. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 years ago, melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise worldwide. The rising Mediterranean Sea eventually broke through the Bosporus Strait with a force 200 times stronger than Niagara Falls, flooding the area we now know as the Black Sea. How fast did it happen? Fast enough that anyone living in the region would have seen their world swallowed by water almost overnight. Archaeologists found shells of freshwater mollusks below the seafloor, directly beneath layers of saltwater mollusks. When dated, the freshwater shells were all the same age, suggesting they were wiped out by a sudden flood. But it doesn't stop there. Marine archaeologist Robert Ballard, the guy who found the Titanic, discovered remnants of ancient structures and tools on the floor of the Black Sea. These findings suggest people were living there when the flood hit. Imagine waking up one day to find water pouring into your farmland with no way to escape. Sound familiar? Even crazier, this isn't just a one-off. Cultures from Mesopotamia to India, from the Mayans to the Chinese, all have flood stories eerily similar to Noah's Ark. In each, there's often a chosen figure, much like Noah, who survives the flood with their family and animals. Coincidence? Or are these stories all connected to one ancient event? Of course, the Bible describes the flood as global, while most scientific evidence points to a regional event like the one in the Black Sea. But here's a thought. For people living at the time, their world was as far as their eyes could see. If a flood wiped out their entire civilization, it would feel global, wouldn't it? And the question remains, if the flood stories from so many cultures share similar details, does that mean they're all based on the same event? And if so, how did these stories travel so far to people who'd never met? The mystery is as vast as the floodwaters themselves. All right, now that we've explored the Great Flood, let's keep the momentum going. The next story involves fiery destruction raining from the sky. Yep, it's time to dive into Sodom and Gomorrah. 3. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. All right, let's move on to one of the most dramatic stories in the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah. You probably know the gist. 2 cities so wicked that God decides to destroy them with fire and brimstone. Lot and his family are warned to leave, and as they flee, Lot's wife looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. It's an intense story, but here's the thing. It might not just be a cautionary tale. There's evidence that something catastrophic actually happened. Let's start with the biblical description. In Genesis, God rains burning sulfur on the cities, completely obliterating them. The land becomes desolate, with nothing growing there for generations. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as pure mythology. But then archaeologists stumbled onto something that changed everything. The ancient city of Tal el-Hammam in modern-day Jordan. Tal el-Hammam is a fascinating site. It was once the largest city in the region during the Bronze Age, but around 1650 BCE, something catastrophic happened. Archaeologists uncovered a layer of destruction 5 feet thick, filled with burned human bones, melted pottery, and other evidence of extreme heat. Here's where it gets wild. Some of the pottery was so hot it turned to glass. How hot are we talking? Over 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hotter than a volcano. So what could cause heat that intense? Researchers ruled out warfare, volcanic activity, and wildfires. Instead, they came to an astonishing conclusion: a cosmic airburst. That's when a comet or asteroid enters Earth's atmosphere at high speed and explodes before hitting the ground. The explosion creates a shockwave and heat so powerful it can level cities and leave behind the exact kind of destruction found at Tal el-Hammam. Here's the kicker: this isn't just a wild theory. A similar event happened in 1908 in Siberia, known as the Tunguska event. A massive airburst flattened 800 square miles of forest. And scientists believe something even more powerful happened over Sodom and Gomorrah. They also found high levels of salt in the soil, likely from the nearby Dead Sea, which was thrown into the air during the explosion. This salt made the land infertile, just as the Bible describes. Now think about this. If you lived in ancient times and witnessed a massive fireball exploding in the sky, destroying entire cities, how would you describe it? Fire and brimstone seems like a pretty accurate guess, doesn't it? And if your entire world turned into a wasteland afterward, it would feel like divine punishment. But here's what makes this story even more intriguing. The Bible isn't the only place that mentions Sodom and Gomorrah. Ancient texts from other cultures also describe cities destroyed by fire from the heavens. Could they all be talking about the same event? And if so, how did people across such vast distances share similar stories? So, what do we make of this? Whether you believe it's divine judgment or a cosmic coincidence, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of those stories where science and scripture seem to align in surprising ways. And honestly, it raises a lot of questions about how much of the Bible might be rooted in real historical events. But we're just getting warmed up, literally. Next, we're diving into a tale of a sea splitting in two. That's right, we're talking about the parting of the Red Sea. Let's keep going. 4. The parting of the Red Sea. All right, let's talk about one of the most iconic moments in biblical history, the parting of the Red Sea. Picture this: a group of desperate people trapped between a massive body of water and an angry, fast-approaching army. Then, out of nowhere, the water split, creating a dry path right through the sea. Epic, right? But here's the question: could something like this actually happen? The story, from the book of Exodus, describes Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt after Pharaoh finally lets them go. But Pharaoh quickly changes his mind and sends his army in pursuit. The Israelites are cornered at the Red Sea with nowhere to go. That's when God tells Moses to stretch out his staff and the waters part, creating walls of water on either side. The Israelites cross to safety, and as the Egyptian army follows, the waters crash back, wiping them out. It's a story of divine intervention. But what does science have to say? Here's where it gets really interesting. In 2010, researchers from the National Center for Atmospheric Research used computer simulations to study an event called wind set-down. This phenomenon occurs when strong, sustained winds push water away from a specific area, temporarily exposing the seabed. The researchers found that if winds reached 63 miles per hour and lasted for 12 hours, they could have pushed back the waters of a shallow body of water, like the Sea of Reeds. Wait, what's the Sea of Reeds? Turns out, the original Hebrew text doesn't say Red Sea, but Sea of Reeds. Scholars believe the mistranslation happened when the text was translated into Greek. This changes everything because the Sea of Reeds, unlike the massive Red Sea, is a much smaller, shallower body of water where wind set-down is far more plausible. The researchers even pinpointed a potential location, Lake Tanis, in Egypt's Nile Delta. According to their simulations, the right wind conditions could have pushed the waters aside, creating a temporary land bridge for the Israelites to cross. Once the wind stopped, the waters would have rushed back, just as described in the story. It's not exactly walls of water, but it's close enough to make you think twice. But here's the thing. Even with a natural explanation like wind set down, the timing is what makes this story so astonishing. Imagine standing there, watching the water pull back just in time for you to escape. Coincidence? Divine intervention? A little bit of both? That's up for debate, but either way, it's a moment that would have felt miraculous to anyone witnessing it. Now, skeptics might say, okay, but where's the hard evidence? And that's a fair question. While we don't have physical proof of the event itself, the story has persisted for thousands of years, passed down through generations. That kind of staying power often hints at a kernel of truth, even if the details have been embellished over time. So, what do we make of it? Whether you see it as science, faith, or a combination of the two, The parting of the Red Sea remains one of the most fascinating stories where ancient texts and natural phenomena seem to intersect. It's a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary events can have a basis in the ordinary, just with a bit of perfect timing. And speaking of extraordinary, our next story involves the sun standing still in the sky. Yes, you heard that right. Let's explore this mind-bending tale next. 5. The sun standing still. All right, this next story dives straight into the extraordinary, because we're talking about a day when the sun stood still. Yep, you heard that right. The Bible tells us about a moment where time itself seemed to freeze, giving one army the upper hand in battle. So, what's the story? And could something like this actually happen? The account comes from the book of Joshua, chapter 10. Joshua, the leader of the Israelites, is in the heat of battle against the armies of 5 Amorite kings. As the day progresses, Joshua realizes there's not enough daylight left to secure victory. So he does something daring. He prays to God and asks for the sun and moon to stand still. According to the text, that's exactly what happens. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. It's a jaw-dropping moment, but let's be real. Stopping the sun? That sounds impossible. Yet, in 2017, 2 researchers, Colin Humphreys and Graham Waddington, proposed a theory that might explain this story through science. They suggest it wasn't the sun literally stopping, but rather an annular solar eclipse. This happens when the moon passes in front of the sun but doesn't cover it completely, leaving a glowing ring of fire in the sky. Here's the wild part. Using astronomical calculations, the researchers pinpointed a specific date for this event, October 30th, 1207 BCE. On that day, a rare annular eclipse occurred over the region where the Israelites were likely fighting. For people back then, seeing the sun suddenly dim or appear to freeze in the sky during a crucial moment would have felt miraculous. Imagine fighting a life-or-death battle and looking up to see the sun behave in a way you couldn't explain. It would have felt like the heavens themselves were intervening. But that's just one theory. Others suggest the story might reference a meteorological phenomenon, like an extended day due to unusual atmospheric conditions. Or it could be symbolic, a poetic way of saying the Israelites fought with unmatched determination, as if the day had been stretched out to ensure their victory. Still, the idea of an actual celestial event has intrigued scientists and historians for years. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The story of the sun behaving strangely isn't unique to the Bible. Ancient texts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even Mesoamerica describe similar events where the sun or moon seems to stop or act erratically. Could they all be referencing the same celestial phenomenon? Or are these stories independent yet eerily similar accounts of something humans have long struggled to understand? One detail that makes the Joshua account so compelling is its precision. The Bible says the event happened near Gibeon, which aligns with the path of the eclipse researchers identified. If the story is based on a real event, it suggests the ancient writers were documenting something they didn't fully understand but knew was extraordinary. Of course, skeptics argue that the story might simply be a way to highlight Joshua's leadership and faith. But even then, it raises fascinating questions. Why would so many cultures, separated by geography and time, describe celestial events that mirror this one? It's a mystery that continues to inspire debate and research. Whether you see the story as a miracle, a metaphor, or an astronomical event, it's another example of how the Bible captures moments that resonate across cultures and history. And it reminds us that sometimes, even the most extraordinary tales may have a kernel of truth behind them. And speaking of extraordinary, let's jump into our next story. A young shepherd facing off against a giant with nothing but a sling and a whole lot of courage. It's time to talk about David and Goliath. All right, let's shift gears to one of the most famous underdog stories of all time, David versus Goliath. It's the tale of a young shepherd with a sling going up against a fearsome giant warrior and winning. It's the ultimate against all odds story. But here's the twist. There's evidence this might not just be a legend. Here's how the Bible sets it up. The Israelites are at war with the Philistines. Every day, a massive warrior named Goliath steps out from the Philistine camp, challenging the Israelites to single combat. He's intimidating, described as 6 cubits and a span tall, which is about 9 feet. For 40 days, no one dares to take him on. That is, until a young shepherd named David steps up. Armed with just a sling and some stones, David faces Goliath, hits him in the forehead with a single stone, and takes him down. For years, Scholars thought this was just a metaphorical tale, David representing the little guy and Goliath symbolizing overwhelming odds. But recent discoveries are giving us reasons to reconsider. Let's start with Goliath himself. Was he really a giant? In 2005, archaeologists digging in the ancient city of Gath, Goliath's hometown, found a shard of pottery with a name inscribed on it that translates roughly to Goliath. While it's not definitive proof of the Goliath, it suggests that a figure by that name existed around the right time period. Even more intriguing, researchers uncovered enormous spearheads at Gath, far too large for an average man to wield. Could these have belonged to a larger-than-average warrior? It's not impossible. But what about David's weapon? A sling might not sound like much, but in ancient warfare, it was a serious tool. Slingers were known for their accuracy and power, and they could launch stones at speeds of up to 100 miles per hour. One well-aimed shot could kill or incapacitate a heavily armed opponent, just like in David's story. So, David defeating Goliath with a sling isn't just plausible. It's practical. Then there's the question of Goliath's height. Was he really 9 feet tall? Some experts suggest the measurement could be an exaggeration or a mistranslation of the ancient text. Others point to conditions like gigantism, a rare disorder that can cause excessive growth. While we may never know exactly how tall Goliath was, the discovery of oversized weapons and structures at Gath suggests that he wasn't your average soldier. And here's a fun twist. Some researchers believe that Goliath might have had poor vision due to his possible gigantism. This could explain why David, a nimble and accurate slinger, had the advantage against a much slower opponent. But the story doesn't end there. Beyond the historical evidence, David and Goliath is a tale that resonates with people across time and cultures. It's about courage, cleverness, and the idea that brains can triumph over brawn. Whether it's a sports team, a business startup, or just someone standing up for what's right, we all love a good underdog story. So, was David's victory over Goliath a historical event, a symbolic tale, or a bit of both? The evidence we have hints that there's more truth to this story than we once thought. And whether you see it as history, myth, or a mix of the two, it's a story that continues to inspire. Next up, we're heading into the story of a tower so ambitious that it angered God himself. Yep, we're talking about the Tower of Babel. Let's dive in. The Tower of Babel. All right, let's talk about humanity's ultimate, too big for their britches moment. The Tower of Babel. It's a story about ambition, unity, and a project so audacious that God himself decides to step in and put a stop to it. But is there any truth to it? Could such a tower have existed? And why did it spark divine intervention? The Bible describes a time when the whole world spoke one language and worked together. They decided to build a city with a tower that reached to the heavens, saying, "Let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." The tower represented their pride and defiance, but God wasn't having it. To stop them, he confused their language, causing miscommunication and scattering them across the globe. Now, the idea of a tower that could reach the heavens might sound like pure exaggeration, but let's dig into the historical context. In ancient Mesopotamia, the region where this story likely originated, massive structures called ziggurats were a common sight. These were multi-tiered towers built as places of worship, often dedicated to the gods of the city. The most famous of these was the Etemenanki, a ziggurat in Babylon that some believe inspired the Tower of Babel story. Etemenanki was no small feat of engineering. Its name literally means Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. Built by King Nebuchadnezzar II, this towering structure was said to rise over 300 feet, a staggering height for its time. Archaeologists have found inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar describing the construction of the ziggurat, including its use of baked bricks and bitumen, materials also mentioned in the Bible. But here's where things get even more interesting. Linguists and historians have long been intrigued by the story of Babel, particularly its explanation for the origin of languages. While the biblical narrative attributes the confusion of tongues to divine intervention, modern science points to a gradual evolution of languages as humans spread across the world. However, the sudden scattering described in the Bible could echo a real historical event, like the fall of a great city or the collapse of a civilization that forced people to migrate. And let's not overlook the symbolic meaning. The Tower of Babel story isn't just about a building, it's about the dangers of hubris. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when humanity's ambition outpaces its humility. The tower was meant to unify people and make them famous, but instead, it became the reason they were divided. It's a theme that feels surprisingly relevant even today. So, did the Tower of Babel exist? While there's no definitive proof of a single tower that matches the biblical description, the similarities between the story and the ziggurats of Babylon are hard to ignore. And the lesson it teaches, that unchecked pride can lead to downfall, might just be universal. Adam and Eve. All right, let's rewind all the way back to the beginning. Literally. The story of Adam and Eve is one of the most well-known biblical accounts detailing the origins of humanity. It's a tale of creation, temptation, and consequences. But here's the big question. Could there be any scientific truth to it? According to the Bible, God created Adam as the first man, placing him in the Garden of Eden. Later, realizing that Adam needed a companion, God created Eve from one of Adam's ribs. Together, they lived in paradise, until they were tempted by a serpent to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, an act that led to their expulsion from Eden. The story ends with Adam and Eve leaving the garden, setting humanity on a path of struggle and survival. At first glance, this might seem like pure mythology. After all, science tells us that humans evolved over millions of years, not from a single couple. But recent discoveries in genetics have added a fascinating twist to this ancient story. Let's talk about mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, two scientific concepts that have nothing to do with the Bible but sound eerily similar. Mitochondrial Eve refers to the most recent common ancestor of all living humans through maternal lineage, traced through mitochondrial DNA. Y chromosome Adam, on the other hand, is the most recent common ancestor of all living men through paternal lineage, traced through the Y chromosome. Here's where it gets intriguing. Studies show that mitochondrial Eve lived roughly 200,000 years ago in Africa, while Y chromosome Adam lived around 100,000 years ago. For a long time, scientists believed they never overlapped in time, let alone met. But in 2013, new genetic research suggested their timelines might have overlapped more than we thought, raising the possibility that a pair of ancestors could be linked to all of humanity. But wait. Before you start picturing Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, it's important to note that these aren't the first humans. They're simply the most recent ancestors from whom all humans alive today inherit their maternal and paternal genetic lines. So, while it's not exactly the biblical version, the science does point to a single point of origin for humanity's genetic heritage. And here's another fascinating angle. The story of Adam and Eve isn't unique to the Bible. Many ancient cultures have creation myths involving a first man and woman, often set in a paradise-like environment. Could these stories be echoes of a shared ancient memory, passed down through generations and shaped by different cultural lenses? Of course, the scientific and theological interpretations of humanity's origins are very different. But the overlap is striking enough to make you wonder, how did ancient people develop these stories long before modern science provided genetic evidence of a shared human ancestry? Whether you see it as divine inspiration or a remarkable coincidence, it's a compelling thought. And let's not forget the deeper message of the Adam and Eve story. Beyond its literal interpretation, it's a tale about choices, consequences, and the complexity of human nature. It's a reminder that, from the very beginning, humanity has grappled with questions of morality, temptation, and the pursuit of knowledge. So, could there be truth to the story of Adam and Eve? While we may never know for sure, it's clear that the themes of the tale, creation, connection, and the human condition, resonate across time, science, and culture. 9. The Biblical Plagues of Egypt. All right, let's turn to one of the most dramatic and terrifying stories in the Bible, the 10 Plagues of Egypt. It's the stuff of epic films and Sunday school legends, a series of supernatural disasters sent by God to convince Pharaoh to release the Israelites from slavery. But here's the burning question. Were these plagues purely divine miracles, or could there be a scientific explanation? The Bible paints a vivid picture of the plagues, each one worse than the last. The Nile turns to blood. Frogs swarm the land. Gnats and flies infest every corner. Livestock die. People break out in boils. Hail rains down, locusts devour crops, darkness falls, and finally, the death of the firstborn strikes Egypt. It's a sequence of calamities so catastrophic that Pharaoh ultimately relents, freeing the Israelites, though not before a dramatic chase to the Red Sea. Let's break this down. Some researchers believe that the plagues could have been triggered by a combination of natural disasters and climatic events. For example, the first plague, the Nile turning to blood, might not have been literal blood, but rather a phenomenon called red tide. This occurs when toxic algae blooms in water, turning it a reddish color and killing fish, which would explain the stench and the death of aquatic life. Next come the frogs, which could have been forced out of their usual habitats by the toxic water. With frogs invading dry land and eventually dying off, it's easy to see how the absence of their natural predators might lead to an explosion in insect populations, like the gnats and flies described in the third and fourth plagues. But it doesn't stop there. The fifth plague, which killed Egypt's livestock, could be tied to diseases spread by the booming insect populations. And the boils? Some scientists speculate they might have been caused by anthrax spores, which can infect both humans and animals, spreading through contaminated water or air. The seventh plague, hail, aligns with a potential climate event. Ancient Egypt experienced periods of extreme weather, and massive hailstorms aren't unheard of in the region. Similarly, the locusts of the eighth plague could have been driven by changes in weather patterns, which create the perfect conditions for swarms. Then there's the ninth plague, darkness over Egypt. This could have been caused by a massive sandstorm, a volcanic eruption, or even an eclipse. Imagine a sky darkened for days, leaving people terrified and disoriented. And finally, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, might be the hardest to explain scientifically. Some theories suggest that contaminated grain stored in lower levels of homes could have released deadly toxins, which disproportionately affected the eldest children who traditionally received the first portions of food. Now, does this mean the plagues weren't miraculous? Not necessarily. Even if natural events played a role, the timing and sequence of these disasters would still be extraordinary. To the people of the time, it would have felt like divine intervention, especially when combined with Moses' prophetic warnings. What's fascinating is how the story of the plagues resonates with other ancient cultures. Similar accounts of disasters and divine retribution appear in Mesopotamian, Greek, and even Indian texts. Could these stories be inspired by shared memories of natural catastrophes, or do they point to something more profound? Ultimately, whether you see the plagues as acts of God, natural phenomena, or a mix of both, the story is one of liberation, resilience, and the power of belief. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change is possible. Next up, we'll explore a moment when the heavens themselves seem to intervene, a celestial phenomenon that still baffles scientists today. Let's dive into the story of the star that led the Magi to Bethlehem. The Star of Bethlehem. Let's wrap things up with one of the most famous celestial events in history, the Star of Bethlehem. Whether you're religious or not, you've probably heard the story of the wise men, or Magi, following a bright star to find the newborn Jesus. But here's the question. Was this star a divine miracle, or could it have been a real astronomical event? The Bible describes the Magi, likely scholars or astrologers, seeing a star rising in the east and interpreting it as a sign of a great king's birth. They follow the star to Bethlehem, where they present gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the infant Jesus. It's a beautiful story, but what could this star have been? Astronomers and historians have spent centuries trying to decode the Star of Bethlehem. One theory is that it was a comet, possibly Halley's Comet, which was visible around 12 BCE. Comets have long been seen as omens of significant events, so it's easy to see why ancient people might associate one with the birth of a king. However, Halley's Comet doesn't perfectly match the timeline of Jesus' birth, which most scholars place around 4 to 6 BCE. Another possibility is a planetary conjunction. This happens when two or more planets appear very close together in the sky, creating a bright point of light. In 7 BCE, Jupiter and Saturn aligned in the constellation Pisces, a rare and striking event that some believe could have inspired the Magi. For ancient astrologers, Jupiter symbolized kingship, Saturn was linked to the Jewish people, and Pisces was associated with Israel. It's a fascinating combination that seems too perfect to ignore. A third theory is a supernova, a massive explosion of a dying star that creates an incredibly bright light visible for weeks or months. While no supernova remnants have been definitively linked to this time period, ancient Chinese records mention a guest star appearing in the sky around 5 BCE. Could this have been the Star of Bethlehem? And then there's the simplest explanation. The star could have been a story, a symbolic way to emphasize the significance of Jesus' birth. In many cultures, celestial events are used to mark important moments, blending the natural and the divine. The Star of Bethlehem might be less about what happened in the sky and more about what it represents, a guiding light leading to hope and salvation. What's fascinating is how this story connects the heavens with the human experience. Whether the star was a comet, a conjunction, or a metaphor, it's a reminder of how we've always looked to the sky for answers. Even today, we marvel at the stars, wondering about our place in the universe and seeking meaning in the vastness. So, was the Star of Bethlehem real? Science can't give us a definitive answer, but maybe that's part of the magic. Sometimes, the most enduring mysteries are the ones that leave room for wonder. And there you have it. 10 biblical events that might not be just stories, but windows into the intersection of faith, history, and science. From the Great Flood to the parting of the Red Sea, from David and Goliath to the creation of the universe, these tales show us something incredible. The power of human imagination, the wonder of the natural world, and the enduring mysteries of our past. But here's the thing. These stories aren't just about what happened thousands of years ago. They're about us. They're about how we seek meaning, how we explain the unexplainable, and how we connect with something greater than ourselves. Whether you see them as literal events, metaphors, or a blend of both, their impact on culture, belief, and human history is undeniable. So, what do you think? Are these stories rooted in real events? Are they divine miracles, natural phenomena, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey through ancient mysteries, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe for more content that explores the fascinating overlap of science, history, and faith. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.